Right, so on to the first panel, and David Talbot. Now, David is president of the International Centre for Transitional Justice, which works to advance peace and reconciliation in post-conflict nations. He's had a distinguished career in the field as Registrar of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, advising the UN Secretary General during the Khmer Rouge trials, and as Deputy Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He played an incredibly important role in advising on the creation of the International Criminal Court. I haven't actually seen David for about 15 years, so I'm very delighted to reintroduce myself with him today. And perhaps, David, you could come to the stage and introduce your panel. Thank you.
We have Dr. Shireen Abadi, who's here. Doctor, please. Let me just say a few words about her before we introduce the next panelist. And it's a very great honor to have her with us today. She's a Nobel laureate. She's the first female judge in Iran, a longtime human rights lawyer, and a member, importantly, of the Aurora Prize Selection Committee. So it's an honor to have you here, Judge. Thank you. We now have Hannah Jelani. Here we are. Please. She is one of my heroes. She's a very respected internationally human rights lawyer from Pakistan. She's formerly the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Human Rights Defenders and is a member of the Elders. She is also on the Aurora Prize Selection Committee, amongst many other honors. Next, I'd like Dr. Ed Luck to come up. Ed, where's Ed? Ed is currently professor of professional practice in international and public affairs, as well as the director of the specialization in international conflict resolution at Columbia University. And he is, very importantly, formerly the special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the responsibility to protect, which is an important element of our discussion today. And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Stephen Luckert, who is the Senior Program Curator at the Levine Institute for the Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Museum. Steve. And I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank Ruben, particularly, and his initiative on 100 Lives, and for this great conference. I think it's very well organized and very timely, because we are really in the depths of what I would call a displacement crisis. I call it a displacement crisis because I think we need to differentiate it from a refugee crisis. It's not the product of a natural disaster. It's not the product of some kind of unforeseen catastrophe. It's a product of systematic human rights abuses, of deliberate policies, and of really flagrant violations of the rules of international law. So I think we need to recognize this, and we need to take account of some of the policy failures. Obviously, the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq is one, but I think there are a broad array of actors on both the international and national levels that have failed, and we need to take this into account. Obviously, Assad and others bear a very great responsibility for this displacement crisis, but the policy failures, I think, by the international community as a whole are really legion. I think we should also bear in mind from the outset that we're not simply talking about Syria or the Middle East and North Africa. There's a displacement crisis in a number of African countries as well. South Sudan comes to mind, Mali, in Asia, Burma, and a number of other countries. And I think that it's a very good discussion that we can have now that's framed a bit around the humanitarian index that's just been presented by Jerry. I think it's very valuable in showing particularly this lack of understanding of this very serious displacement crisis. And I think we all bear some responsibility in ensuring that it is properly addressed and properly understood. So I really ask the panelists to address two broad questions, and we'll have a discussion here and then hopefully have enough time to open it up. But one is really the roots of the displacement crisis. What are they? How do we identify them? And secondly, how can we address those crises, that crisis? I think we need to think more critically about how we can prevent displacement crisis in the future, as well as address this one. Now, it's hardly the first time we face such crises, but I do think that this is probably the level of displacement is at a scale that we haven't seen in this world since the post-World War II period. So we have a truly outstanding panel to talk about these issues. And I'm going to start on my right with Dr. Abadi. Now, I wanted to note that she will be speaking through simultaneous translation, and I believe it's channel 1 that she'll be speaking on. So, Dr. Abadi, I wanted to ask you what you see as the root causes of this displacement crisis, and what are the failures both in terms of policy and on the ground in these countries. And I'm particularly interested in your assessment of the situation in the Middle East, Syria, and beyond. So, Dr. Abadi, if I could give you the floor.
The root causes of displacement are, there are several roots. Sometimes it's war. Sometimes it could be poverty and unemployment, and sometimes it could be environmental crisis that leads to displacement, and at times it could be none of the aforementioned. It could be a dictatorship that exists in a country. For instance, in Iran, we do not see any of the aforementioned roots, but the despotism and dictatorship that exists in Iran has resulted in the flight of many Iranians who have migrated. And even among the flood of the refugees who have recently arrived in Europe, there are some Iranians. Therefore, all these factors could be effective in the current situation. But since I actually come from the Middle East, please allow me to focus on the crisis in the Middle East and wars and conflicts that exist in the Middle East. Currently, the highest number of refugees, as you have heard in statistics, are from Syria, then it's Iraq. And why has this happened? Basically, why did a war start in Syria in the first place? The cause of all this in the Middle East is despotism that sadly exists in many countries in that region. If the Assad dynasty had not reigned in Syria for 45 years in such a dictatorship, people would not have staged an uprising. If instead of Gaddafi in Libya, they would have had a democratic and a national government, people would never have staged an uprising leading to a civil war in Libya, thus forcing the people to flee in order to save their lives. If I want to really delve into such issues, it would take a very long time, and sadly we don't have much time. That's why I have to quickly highlight a few factors. And now there is one big question here. Why in that region there are so few democratic and governments? Why is it that in that part of the world there is such a degree of despotism? Why is it that somebody, when somebody becomes president, he becomes president for life in that region? And they don't want to give up power, the likes of which were Saddam Hussein, Hafiz Assad, and there were hundreds of others. And it's here that we should say that the reason for that is the weak culture of democracy in that region, and we shouldn't put all the blame on the West. Of course, the West is to some extent responsible, especially the capitalist world. We cannot say that they are not, they should not bear any guilt, because this region has been an oil-rich region and therefore a victim to avarice and greed. So had the governments in the region actually thought about the interests of the people, it would have been different. And they would not have spent the main bulk of the budget on buying military weapons and luxurious goods. Yes, the West and the capitalist world is to some extent guilty, but I think at the same time, I think the civil society and people in that region are not doing enough, and we need to empower them so that they can spread the culture of democracy. I know I don't have much time, but I would like to highlight this point, that the West is guilty, but from many years ago there was another person that has been guilty, and that was Iran. Had Iran not supported Assad, there would not have been this war in that country. Or the situation in Yemen, and that is also because of Iran's interference in that country that the situation has been created in Yemen. The same applies to Iraq and Iranian interference. And now there's also Saudi Arabia, which for many years has seen itself as the leader of the Islamic world and thought that it is the Saudi Arabia who should have the final say on everything. However, after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the Iranian government decided to started seeing itself as the leader of the Islamic world. So, thanks to the ambitions of two dictatorships, there's a conflagration in the Middle East. All these factors together has led to the current state of affairs and crisis. And in the second round, I will tell you what the solutions are. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. And we're really looking forward to the second round now. So, Hannah, why don't I turn to Hannah Jelani now and ask her, you've just heard Dr. Abadi's description. She talked about despotism, lack of democracy, even across that region. I wonder if you might talk a little bit more broadly, because this crisis goes beyond the Middle East. It goes throughout the world. And I would be really interested in your thoughts on what role does the failure to protect human rights play in this, and particularly, what are the human rights actors? What should they be doing? I know you have a lot of experience in this area.
David, let me first of all thank the organizers for holding such a brilliant event. As a human rights defender, I feel extremely privileged being a part of such events and being amongst people who give human rights defenders that inspiration, but also that sense of security. Because our security doesn't come from any policeman guarding us. Our security really comes from people around the world who care about the issues that we are addressing in our own different capacities in our countries. And not only care about, but there are so many people who are actively engaged in struggling against different factors that cause human rights violations. Now, coming directly to the question you have asked, we all know that human rights violations are both the cause and the consequence of several factors that we as academics, as human rights defenders, as civil society actors, journalists, lawyers, we are trying to address those factors. These include bad governance. These include use of plurality for negativity and creating divisions and creating conflicts, rather than celebrating the diversity of our populations and finding the common interest which will draw them together and work towards prosperity. We create an environment of competition, whether it is between religious groups or ethnic groups. We create an environment in which many times states have an interest. And many of those factors are exacerbated and conflict provoked by state policy very deliberately. At other times, states ignore their responsibility to hold accountable actors who are creating the environment for a conflict, many times for certain political or economic interests. And we are seeing this all over the world, and I don't think I have to go into the details of these with this kind of an audience, because all of them are in many ways dealing with either the state's open connivance with powerful economic groups, political groups, religious groups, that has led the state in many parts of the world to increase its power of control, but diminish its commitment to protect. And I think these are some of the causes that lead human rights defenders into a field where there are so many challenges. And I believe that the work of defense of human rights is impossible to do, and strategies are impossible to be constructed until we are very well aware not only of the national political climate, but also the global political climate, because this is a globalized world, whether we like it or not. What happens in one part of the world affects the other. Coming from South Asia, I know that we live in a region where both our social, economic, and cultural rights, as well as our political rights and civil rights, are very much affected by what is happening across the border. This is a region where we were one people at one time, but the whole question of plurality was very negatively resolved, and we were divided. So when we shared a common interest, we were more willing to accommodate each other's needs and to look more tolerantly at the way of life that our neighbor had. Now we don't do that. Just to enter into the next thought that I had in my mind very briefly, I know that there are many, many things that need to be done in terms of correcting politics, in terms of correcting the style of governance. But let us not forget that many people say poverty is the root cause of many of the displacement crises that we are looking at. I feel a little differently. I think it is the failure to address poverty that is leading to these crises. Poverty is a reality which we have to change. So, and it's not the condition of poverty that we have to focus. We have to focus on the poor. So when people talk of alleviation of poverty, it gives me a little bit of a discomfort. We can alleviate poverty only progressively. But while poverty is being alleviated, what do we do to alleviate the suffering of the poor? So poor-centered policies rather than policies centered on alleviation of poverty would give me much more satisfaction. Secondly, when crises happen and refugees, asylum seekers, displaced people internally become for us an issue and a crisis. They are not issues and crises. These are people going through a very difficult time and going through sufferings which have not come because of their making, but because of the making of somebody who's taking on policies which is affecting their lives in such a disastrous way. What I see, and I've seen that as a Pakistani living next to Afghanistan in the 80s, I've seen it in other parts of South Asia, I see it now in the Middle East. Please, refugees have to be dealt with in a manner in which we focus on these people and their needs. Governments, nations have a tendency of using refugees for political agendas. Please, I think that's the most cruel thing that anyone can do. I take this opportunity to make this plea to world leaders. Please do not use the presence of refugees either in your country or in your neighboring countries or in your region for taking forward political agendas. These are very real issues. These are very real people. There are children, women, vulnerable communities that we need to take care of.
That's terrific. I think your last point is one that we should all very much focus on, and I think the point that you make about the poor, rather than talking about poverty, but talking about the poor is really fundamentally important, and a number of issues relating to human rights. I'm also very glad that you brought up the issue of the commitment to protect, which I'm going to take up with Ed in just a moment. But first I want to turn to Steve and ask him to help give us some historical context here. I know you've looked at other displacement or refugee crises, particularly in the World War II, post-World War II setting. So I wonder if you could give us some historical perspective on this, and also perhaps comment on maybe some of the material in the Humanitarian Index and how it might help us analyze these factors. So, Steve, turn to you.
Thank you very much, David. Sadly, the problem of refugees and mass displacement is an old one. As Ed pointed out earlier today, this has been going on for at least 100 years. When you think back to the years of the First World War, you had, for instance, the Tsarist government in Russia carrying out the mass deportations of Jews and ethnic Germans whom they considered to be traitors or potential traitors. Likewise, think about the Armenian genocide carried out by the Ottoman Empire in 1915, and the mass deaths and the mass displacement of millions of people that caused. And also, not only of Armenians, but also of other Christian minorities and of the Greek populations there. And this was an issue that wasn't particularly solved. You had, for instance, during the Russian revolutions, you had over 1.5 million Russians fleeing from the before it became the Soviet Union, but Soviet Russia, and they found themselves in a very awkward position because they had no state protection. And there was really nothing in international law that was done to really, a solution had to be devised to offer them some type of protection. So you had the Nansen passports that were created to aid them. But they were still refugees in 1933 when Adolf Hitler came to power. And Adolf Hitler precipitated yet another refugee crisis. Some people calculated that in 1933, there were already 4 million refugees that were needing some kind of protection. Hitler began this policy of forced emigration of the Jewish population, and he pursued that until the fall of 1941, when Nazi Germany embarked upon a new policy, which was mass extermination, in order to solve the so-called Jewish question. And at that time, the world, of course, was faced with this massive crisis, and it wasn't the only one going on. You have to think about during the Spanish Civil War, over 500,000 Spanish Republicans left Spain to go to France, and many of them were set up in internment camps. You also had in the Soviet Union, you had mass displacement as a result of dekulakization, and also the deportation of ethnic minorities, already in the 1930s. The world, of course, was faced with a challenge. How do you deal with all these different issues? In the case of the Jews being forced to leave from Germany, there were various committees that were set up, private organizations. A League of Nations High Commissioner for Political Refugees from Germany was established, but it was dependent on private donations. That is, there was no international governmental response. Much of the response had to be done at individual governmental levels. And for instance, in the United States, there was really no refugee policy. It was immigration policy. There was a great deal of sympathy for the plight of refugees, as was pointed out even in this report on the Humanitarian Index. So this is a similar thing. As the climate of opinion in the United States, for instance, turned against Nazi Germany, particularly after 1938. There was a great deal of sympathy, but that didn't translate into action. That is, you had a great deal of sympathy pointed out in polls, but that you would still have 75% of those polled who were unwilling to open the doors up to refugees any further than they were. That is, there was sympathy but a lack of action. And even with the outbreak of war, that it was exacerbated. Franklin Roosevelt calculated in October of 1939 that he believed that the war would create conditions for 10 to 20 million people being displaced and becoming refugees. Well, the war showed that many millions more were displaced, not only with the forced deportations and mass murder of the Jews, but you had the use of slave labor on a grand scale, and it became a huge post-war problem. And you had to have a special organization, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, set up to deal with that challenge of repatriating millions of people to their homes. But then there was also the issue of those who either could not or would not go back to their homes, including many Jews who faced continued persecution after the war.
Thanks very much, Steve. Good presentation. What I'd like to do, Ed, I'd like to turn to you, and I'd be interested in your take on the displacement crisis. I know you've done a lot of work on the RTP doctrine, the responsibility to protect. And how do you assess the RTP doctrine and the crisis and how it's handled? What can we learn from it, this experience? How might it be more effective in the future? And I think we tend to, when we're considering the right to protect, responsibility to protect, we think of states primarily. But does the individual have a role? Do we have a role in this responsibility to protect, or is it simply our governments and the international organizations? Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate it. I should acknowledge at the beginning that the father of Responsibility to Protect, Gareth Evans, is here, and we'll be hearing from Gareth later. So I always have to be a little careful what I say on the subject in case I might be corrected later. But let me say a couple things based on my experience of working with the Secretary General for about 6 years in this area. And it was a very embryonic area. And I must say one that was quite controversial. and remains in some ways controversial. I do think there's been a lot of progress on the normative side. I think there's general acceptance that there should be state responsibility for the populations on its territory. I think there's general acceptance that there should be an international responsibility, certainly to prevent and to respond. There are controversies still about military response. There is controversy about military response on any subject, and this is one more. And there are questions about Security Council decision-making. But I must say we've made a lot of progress, I think, with the member states, and I think this is something that's here to stay. It wasn't a passing idea. It's something that has very deep roots. And unfortunately, as we see the growing ranks of refugees and forcibly displaced, as we see the number of mass atrocities, some people would say, well, that means that R2P hasn't cured everything. Well, of course it hasn't. But it also means that it's needed more and more. And what I think people don't see are the many cases where quiet preventive action has been taken, either so that atrocities didn't begin, or they began and recurred before they became too large. And I think we also have to look at a lot of places that have had this kind of crimes in the past and trying to prevent them to be a reoccurrence. It's often said that the best predictor of genocide is past genocide. So I think the accountability issues, many of the things that you've worked on so much, David, are very important in this regard. Now, let me say a couple of things about the sources, because I think it's relevant to this experience. I haven't found that there's a direct correlation between human rights violations per se and the likelihood that there will be mass atrocities committed. We found a number of cases, the first one I dealt with, Kenya, after the 2007 election, a place where there had not been a particularly nasty human rights record. But with the election results that people didn't accept, power struggle, very quickly this was turned into sectarian violence. It looked like it was going to escalate rather badly. You remember masses of people being burned in churches, other things. It had a lot of the feeling of Rwanda to it. So the former Secretary General, the current Secretary General, many others were involved in the mediation. It worked out in the end, I think, reasonably well. But if you had simply looked at places that were with the most chronic human rights violations, it wouldn't have been a perfect match. There have been other places with quite bad human rights records, which unfortunately have been chronic and weren't changing in the way that might have led to mass atrocities. And so one of the things that we found out in this experience is you have to look particularly at the issue of preventing genocide and other mass atrocities, not simply say it's a subset of human rights or a subset of peacekeeping or a subset of conflict resolution. You ask different questions and you look for different things. And these are very uncomfortable questions. They're not the sorts of things that fit naturally and easily into international diplomacy. You're saying things to leaders that they don't want to hear. You're saying things to populations that they don't want to hear. There's no country that wants to say we're on the eve of mass atrocities, that these things could happen here. Everyone thinks it happens somewhere else. And that, of course, is a dangerous thing. So we have to recognize that we need things like the responsibility to protect because it forces people to ask the right questions. And we'll never get the right answers if we don't ask the right questions. So I think this is a particular field that's developing. I think it's developing reasonably well, but it's still at best in an embryonic stage. And it's a long, long-term effort. We've had a genocide convention for almost 70 years. It's only really been since R2P's been around there's been any real effort to build a strategy to make it operational, to put it into practice. Otherwise, it was simply acknowledged, but it wasn't made part of policy and it wasn't made part of strategy. And that is what R2P is bringing to this. Now, I'm glad and I appreciate that you added the question of the individual responsibility to protect. It's something my wife and I are developing because it's a corollary. Many people think of responsibility as only of states and governments and responsibilities of international institutions. My experience has been the individual piece has been the most critical one. I think that's the spirit behind the Aurora Prize. I think that's what we heard about just now on the Humanitarian Index. Again and again, it's the attitudes of people. And if R2P is to make a difference over time, it's because people are interested and it galvanizes their interest. We have to see the choices that people make before there are mass atrocities, while mass atrocities are occurring, and after they occur. Those choices are critical. We shouldn't say that vulnerable populations should simply wait for other governments or international institutions to come to their aid. That's going to be too late. They have agency. They have choices. And I was just at the Genocide Museum here yesterday, a very moving account of those who did resist and those who did save lives. And that's extremely important. So we don't want a static enterprise where people sit and wait and hope that someone is going to come and help. And if the Security Council doesn't vote in the right way, or people aren't going to have a military solution, that we have no other way through it. Because there is very much a question of prevention. It's very much a question of person-to-person attitudes. It's very much a question of the choices all of us make in these kinds of situations. So I'm very delighted that the Aurora Prize is recognizing those individuals who have made the courageous decisions, because that is the core of R2P, and that is the core of preventing mass atrocities. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. And I wanted to turn to you first and kind of ask you about this prevention issue, which I think is so important. We've already talked about some of the root causes. Ed has outlined responsibility to protect as a key element to prevent displacement crisis in the future, human rights abuses. There are a lot of other tools out there, of course, that we think about. And I was just curious to ask you, human rights is often very much in terms of rhetorical. We have it very high on the agenda rhetorically, but enforcement is weak, as you've already discussed. So I wonder what's your view on the issue of prevention. Where does RTP fit in? Where do other tools fit in? How can we best assure that these kind of violations don't happen in the future?
Well, I wish I had the right answers for what you're asking, and if anybody did have those answers, I think the world would be a different place. But what I look at these issues through the human rights defenders' prisms, and we are in the business of finding solutions even where tools are not available. Because like we just heard, you can't ask an effectee to wait till change is brought about. So you have really to make do with whatever there is that is available. Prevention is possible if the world has patience with plurality, with democracy, and allows it to develop. I agree absolutely that there is that individual responsibility also to protect rather than the state. Today, the crises that we are looking at have a greater element of mischief by non-state actors. Nevertheless, we have to believe and find ways of enforcement through the power of the state. After all, as individual citizens or members of a society, why do we give that power to the state? So that that power can be used to protect us. Impunity for human rights violations gives non-state actors encouragement to continue with that. And in that, I include not only non-state actors who commit political violence, but also non-state actors who misuse economic power. Secondly, impunity for individual violations are as important as mass violations. I know that when, as a human rights defender, we take up causes for advocacy to show the injustice of what we are trying to address in the abstract is not easy. To get public support it is very important that you put a face to a problem. So the voice of the victim is very important for people to understand that a general violation that is occurring in everyday life of a country is affecting people in a certain way. I think that's very important. On a higher plane, let me say, international policies of intervention. I'm all for humanitarian and human rights interventions. But I also think that while preserving the legitimacy of such interventions by the international community, and I strongly believe that there is legitimacy in such interventions, there must be a commonly agreed criteria before such interventions can take place. An analysis of what will happen afterwards. And we have seen in Libya, in Iraq, now we are also, I'm afraid we'll see it in Syria. Regime change has to be a policy or a of intervention that has to be, or objective that has to be revisited. Regime change in my kind of countries and my kind of regions create instability. It throws up greater challenges for the defense of human rights. It throws up greater challenges to find harmony. We are already living with divisions. It is, I think, better to find ways of more dialogue, more or better global leadership that has both the capacity and the ability and commitment to draw people to a table and hold talks and dialogues. I don't mind if it takes longer, but as long as change is brought with a blueprint for what happens afterwards. I think that's extremely important. And then the role of the United Nations. I know people have a great deal of skepticism on that. I think it could improve. I don't know if the authority of the Security Council needs to be enhanced, but certainly its structure needs to be changed. Secondly, not the authority, but the capacity of the United Nations must be enhanced. Countries that are members, states of the United Nations, sometimes take on a role of competing with the United Nations and trying to weaken it. I think that's a mistake. We need a central authority where you don't have the sense that a particular country is dominating you, but that the sense of the international community comes from a multilateral organization. But also, remember, the United Nations is not just states. The Charter of the United Nations starts with we the people, and then somewhere we disappear. We need to bring the United Nations closer to we the people so that what decisions are taking reflect in many ways and to a greater extent the will of the people of the world. So more accessibility and more impact and influence of civil societies.
Dr. Abadi, I wonder if I could call on you first in terms of what Henna just said and what your reaction to it is in terms of a greater role for the United Nations, the possibility in some cases of humanitarian intervention. And if we're thinking about prevention, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa region, what do you think are the tools of prevention of these violations for the future? How do we get at the root causes of this displacement crisis?
The root causes of displacement are not only human rights violations. For instance, there is the environmental crisis or poverty that stems from financial shortages. And all this lead to enforced displacement. However, allow me to focus on the existing crisis. In other words, the situation that has come about. And with much regret, I have to acknowledge that this situation will continue. On average, 6,000 people a day flee the Middle East and Africa towards Europe. And this situation will continue and it will not end. And in my view, if we don't adopt any decisions now, I think the humanitarian crisis will even go further than how it was in the Second World War. Now, what are the solutions? I will divide the solutions into three categories. One is a long-term solution, then there is a medium-term solution, and then there is a short-term solution. As for the long-term solution of these crises, one is that we should bring about a situation in which human dignity is safeguarded. In other words, there should be no wars, there should be no hunger, there should be no despotism. And of course, as I said, this is a long-term project which may take years. But there is no other choice, and this is something that we have to focus on, and which is the dignity of human beings. If we manage to safeguard dignity of human beings, nobody will face dangers such as even risking being drowned in the sea in order to reach Europe. As for the medium-term revolution, is to put an end to the current suffering that exists. And by that, I mean that the ongoing wars must end, and I hope that the peace talks on Syria will not be merely rhetoric, and so far it's been only that. And I hope that the ceasefire in Yemen will not be just temporary. On the one hand, they declare a ceasefire, and on the other, they throw bombs on the people, and they expect the people to be killed in these bombings and not flee for Europe. So that they must be displaced. They have no other solution. As for the short-term solution, that is that many of these refugees, as we heard earlier from one of the panelists, they live in camps in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon. They mainly live in these camps. And I hope that one day you will actually personally go to these camps to actually witness for yourself the plight, the horrific plight of these refugees. They are deprived of the most basic needs, even water, drinking water. If somebody has run away from bombs, to save their lives, they want to go somewhere where they can live. Living in a camp where there is not even drinking water, how long can you live? 6 months, a year, 2 years? For how long can you survive? There are no schools. And sooner or later, and gradually, you are going to have a generation that's going to be illiterate, because they live in these camps which there is no hygiene, no food, and so they have no other choice, these people, but to accept these dangers and go in search of sanctuary to Europe, and in later stages maybe even to go to the United States. Instead of some countries exploiting the plight of refugees in order to gain themselves entry into European Union, and or try and raise funding under the pretext that they are helping the refugees. We have to deal with the situation inside these camps. And to that end, we must not place the entire responsibility on European governments, saying that they should open their borders, all their borders. Europe can only accept refugees to a certain extent. They don't have enough resources. So we need to equip these camps, make sure that they have resources, and they don't even have nappies for babies in these camps. They have no drinking water, as I said, so they need to have better equipped, they must better equip these camps so that people can, when they're accepting risks and they're endangering their lives. In the last month alone, 500 people were drowned as they were trying to reach Europe on a boat. Every month, many are drowned in a bid to arrive in Europe. Why? If they had equipment in these camps, they wouldn't be risking their lives to come to Europe. I want to highlight something tragic, and that is with regards to Islamic countries. Why aren't they not helping these camps? Where is Qatar? Qatar is one of the richest countries where its per capita income is higher than everywhere else. Why are they not helping? Why isn't the United Arab Emirates helping? Why is not Kuwait coming forward to help? Why is it that the responsibility is being put on Germany, Italy, or France, for instance? Why the United Arab Emirates or Qatar? These are countries that need a workforce. They have always brought imported workforce from Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan because it's cheap. So why not use these refugees? Why have you closed the borders to them? Yet, why? Because you don't want to give nationality, a citizen. You don't want to give citizenship to anyone. You only expect Germany to give citizenship to these people? So if you're talking about Islam, if you're talking about Islamic countries sympathizing, where are these Islamic countries? They're not giving money. They're not giving any kind of humanitarian assistance, plus the fact that, unfortunately, many Islamic countries are the causes of this predicament, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia. Or it's the rivalries among them which has led to the status quo. And now all these Islamic countries have stepped back, and they're just crying out about, oh, look at the plight of the Muslims around the world. Where are you, Muslim countries?
Steve, I wanted to turn to you. We're kind of running out of time, but I wondered if you, from your research and experience, what your view on steps for the future, prevention, you might propose based on your study of refugee crises in the past.
Well, I think what's very interesting, and Edward brought this up earlier, was the example of Kenya. And in one of the previous elections, you had a number of activists that were on the ground using cell phone technology to counter the rumors and stories that had helped to incite violence in the previous election. And so that helped to play a role in kind of calming things down. So when reports went out about, some a village being attacked, they would get information about what was really happening and transmitting that to calm that situation down. And that was something done by a lot of individuals. And I thought that's a very good way to use counter speech to deal with propaganda aimed at incitement. The other aspect of this that I think is extremely important is for information to be delivered to the general public about these crises. I think too often, when I look at many of the reports, human rights reports, they're written for other analysts. They're not written for the general public. So consequently, that information is just circulating within a particular group. It's not reaching the general public. So I think that's got to change a bit. I think the museum is making a big step there, for instance, with our Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, so that on the second floor of our building, we're doing exhibitions and things that call attention to what's happening, whether that's in refugee camps in Jordan or what's happening with the Syrian refugees today elsewhere. And so I think using that platform to reach the millions of visitors that we get every year is a good way of doing that. My final point that I want to raise is the importance, for instance, today in encouraging in places like Iraq, where you've had ISIS or Daesh committing genocide against the Yazidi and others, that you have to have the Iraqi government as well as others serve to protect those people from destruction. Because when I look at that, the situation in Iraq, I see many similarities to what happened during the Armenian genocide, where you had minorities targeted. In fact, some of the exact same policies are being used by Daesh in Iraq. And I think there has to be this effort of the Iraqi government and various militias to protect the rights of minorities there. And that's something that, for instance, the museum has called attention to as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Ed, this is probably the final round, so I wanted to get a final word from you. And as we think about RTP, how do we make that more of a reality, number one? And number two, are there other tools in addition to RTP? We've discussed that to some extent, but it might be useful, given your vast experience, to outline some of the other tools for prevention purposes.
Sure, thank you very much. One, I think we should think, whether it's R2P or other tools, less about intervention and more about engagement. We found an awfully lot of cases where we could engage with government authorities, where we could engage in civil society in various places, when they seem to be taking the wrong path and making the wrong choices. And there were several cases in which the Security Council never got involved. I think, for example, of Kyrgyzstan with the violence in Osh in 2010. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced. Differences in religion and ethnicity seem to be at the base of it, along with economic issues and some political issues. Second of all, in that regard, we think of governments, but we really should think of individuals in those governments who could be targeted for messages, who could be reminded that there is something like the International Criminal Court they might have to worry about down the line, that might be worried about the future of their economy, that might be worried about foreign investment, where you can get messages to them, and where international institutions can join with regional institutions and national governments to offer both carrots and sticks if people make different choices. And here I think one of the critical problems that we've seen in recent years is leaders that won't leave, who insist on staying and staying and staying despite popular pressures. And obviously Syria is a case in point. Libya was another case in point. There have been many, many others in recent years. And we have to get better at finding tools to move people on. And I think the African Union has been looking at this quite seriously in recent years. And I think as a larger international community, we have to pay more attention to that. And that's going to involve, among others, the private sector. And I think we very often leave the private sector out of the conversation, or just think of it as a problem rather than as part of a solution. The question of investment, the question of companies that have large numbers of employees in particular places, we should be thinking of them as part of civil society potentially, and not necessarily only as part of the problem, but potentially as part of the solution as well. And just a final word on this, we're about to appoint a new Secretary General. They always like to think they're elected, but according to the charter, they're appointed, and whoever she or possibly he might be, we should be asking very hard questions now about their attitudes towards R2P, their attitudes towards human protection, their understanding of these kinds of situations, and put them to the test, and recognize that ultimately we as citizens, wherever we might live, we have to hold our political leaders accountable. If there isn't a resistance to hate speech, to incitement, to targeting of minorities, that is something which the body politic has to make their leaders accountable for in a political way. Accountability is not only after the fact legal accountability. It has to be political accountability every day. And those are the choices that we make in terms of which issues we think are important, which issues do we protest about, how do we join together, and do we recognize that if some of our fellow citizens are threatened, that we are all threatened. Thank you.
Any time for questions? Well, I'm going to get fired because I didn't manage the time well enough to give the audience questions. So I do want to thank the panelists. Just one word, because I think Ed has talked about accountability, and I think it's important that to know that there's steps that can be taken now for accountability in the future. Obviously, there are a lot of needs that need to be addressed in the displacement crisis, but a number of groups, for example, in Syria, are collecting documents that will be useful in transitional justice measures, including criminal prosecutions, including truth commissions, perhaps for reparations, perhaps for vetting out of human rights abusers, out of the security forces. So documentation is very important, and I think it's never too early to start to work with civil society groups and other active social forces, whether they're outside of the country, probably perhaps inside in some cases, where we can build knowledge about what accountability is about, so that we begin to break this kind of cycle of revenge, so that we avoid the kind of, this is I think an important part of prevention. If we have accountability at some point after these abuses have happened, rather than simply trying to clean the slate clean. And so I think it's really important for us to think about how we can prepare for the time when the displacement crisis ends, so that we build a future on human rights and on accountability, rather than trying to build it on impunity. And I think that's a very important point. So that was going to be my next question to the panel. So I've taken it, and I think this has been a great panel. These are tremendous experts that you have in front of you, and it's been an honor for me to be with them today. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the panel. I think you'll all agree, some very powerful remarks this morning. Shirin Ebadi talking about the deep-seated structural issues behind the refugee crisis, despotism, control, diminishing commitment to protect. Spoke very, very powerfully about the need to tackle the camps, particularly help coming from Islamic countries that's required. Hina Jalali's made, I think, an incredibly important point to us all this morning about how politicians mustn't use the refugee crisis as an excuse to advance domestic policy. These are real people, as she said, children, young people, women, men. Stephen Lockhart gave us the historical perspective. This is nothing new. He gave us a statistic that in 1933, 4 million refugees were already displaced through World War I, and then you talked about the Spanish Civil War, but despite sympathy, you said it wasn't translating into action, which brought us on to Ed Luck and the responsibility of the individual. Ed said this is the most critical issue. It's the attitudes of people that's the most important thing.